In the latter half of the 16th century, in the quiet market town of Stratford-upon-Avon, life moved according to the rhythms of land, weather, church bells, and inherited custom. This was a world where lineage mattered, where marriage bound families as much as individuals, and where the future was shaped less by ambition than by survival. It was into this world that Anne Hathaway was born, long before her name would be forever tied to that of William Shakespeare. Anne Hathaway entered the world in 1556, in the small hamlet of Shottery, just outside Stratford. Her family lived at Hewlands Farm, a sturdy timber-framed farmhouse surrounded by fields of grain and grazing animals. The Hathaways were not nobility, but they were comfortable. They owned land, raised livestock, and held a respected place in the local community. Anne grew up among the smells of hay and hearth smoke, the sounds of livestock and church hymns, and the steady labor that defined rural life. Her education, like that of most girls of her class, would have been informal. Household management, needlework, brewing, dairy work, and the countless skills required to keep a household functioning. Religion was woven into daily existence. The England of Anne's youth was still adjusting to the religious upheavals of the Reformation. The old Catholic traditions lingered in memory and practice even as Protestantism took firm hold. Anne's family, like many in Warwickshire, likely practiced a quiet, conservative faith, careful not to draw attention in uncertain times. Church attendance was mandatory, but belief was often private, passed down through gestures and whispered prayers rather than open declaration. Anne was older than William Shakespeare by 8 years, a detail that would later invite speculation and judgment from historians. In her youth, however, this age difference was unremarkable. Women often married young, but circumstances, family needs, inheritance issues, or opportunity could delay marriage. Anne remained unmarried into her mid-20s, a fact that suggests she was neither unwanted nor desperate, but simply living within the practical realities of rural life. William Shakespeare was born in 1564, the third child of John Shakespeare and Mary Arden. His family lived in Stratford itself, where John worked as a glover and held various civic positions. Though not wealthy, the Shakespeares enjoyed a measure of local prominence. William would have attended the local grammar school, learning Latin rhetoric and classical literature, an education that set him apart from many of his peers. Anne and William's worlds were close geographically, but socially distinct. Her life rooted in agriculture, his shaped increasingly by books and town affairs. Their paths crossed sometime. In the early 1580s, the exact circumstances of their meeting are lost to time. There is no letter, no diary, no witness account to explain how affection grew between them. What survives instead are legal records, dry impersonal documents that hint at urgency and consequence. In November 1582, a marriage bond was issued for William Shakespeare and Anne Hathaway. The bond allowed the marriage to proceed quickly, bypassing the usual public reading of banns. This haste has long been interpreted as evidence of pregnancy. Anne was already carrying a child when she married William. In a society governed by strict moral codes, this fact would have carried social weight. Yet the marriage was sanctioned, recorded, and accepted. There is no evidence of scandal beyond the quiet necessity of speed. On May 26, 1583, Anne gave birth to a daughter, Susanna, baptized in Stratford's Holy Trinity Church. Marriage altered Anne's life fundamentally. She moved from Shottery to Stratford, into the Shakespeare household. The transition would not have been easy. She entered a family with its own tensions and uncertainties. John Shakespeare's fortunes were declining during this period. Debts accumulated and his civic standing diminished. Anne now found herself managing a household under financial strain, with a young husband who, though educated, had not yet established a clear profession. Anne's role was defined by endurance. She raised Susanna, managed domestic affairs, and navigated the expectations placed upon a wife in Elizabethan England. Women were legally subordinate to their husbands, with limited property rights and little public voice. Yet within the household, a wife's authority was substantial. Anne would have overseen food preparation, clothing, child care, and the maintenance of order. Her labor was constant and largely invisible, recorded only through its results. In 1585, Anne gave birth to twins, Hamnet and Judith. The baptism record lists them together, a brief line in the parish register that marks a moment of both joy and burden. 3 children under the age of 3 meant unrelenting responsibility. Infant mortality was high. Illness was common. Medical knowledge was rudimentary. Each day carried risk. It is around this time that William Shakespeare disappears from the historical record for several years, a period often referred to as the lost years. Sometime in the late 1580s, he left Stratford for London. The reasons are uncertain: economic necessity, ambition, or escape. What is clear is that Anne remained behind with the children. Separation was not unusual in this period. Men frequently traveled for work, leaving wives to manage households alone. Yet the emotional weight of such absence is rarely acknowledged in historical accounts. Anne lived with uncertainty, dependent on remittances that may or may not arrive, raising children who scarcely knew their father, and maintaining social respectability in his absence. While William built a career in London's theaters, Anne's life remained rooted in Stratford. She oversaw the children's early years, taught them prayers and manners, tended illnesses, and endured the cycles of hope and fear that defined parenthood. In an age without modern medicine, Hamnet, the only son, carried particular significance. Sons were heirs, bearers of the family name, symbols of continuity. His survival mattered not only emotionally but socially. Anne's world was one of repetition and restraint. She did not write plays or poems. She did not leave behind words that would echo through centuries. Yet her presence shaped the conditions under which those words were written. She provided stability in William's absence, maintained a home to which he could return, and carried the weight of daily life that allowed his work elsewhere. As the 1590s approached, William Shakespeare's name began to appear in London playbills and publications. His success, however, did not immediately translate into reunion. London was distant, travel was slow, and the demands of theater relentless. Anne remained in Stratford, her life largely unchanged by her husband's rising fame. This distance, geographical, experiential, emotional, would later fuel speculation about the nature of their marriage. Yet the surviving evidence resists simple conclusions. There are no letters expressing resentment or affection, no confessions of regret or devotion. What remains instead is a pattern familiar to many early modern marriages: duty sustained over time, shaped by necessity rather than romance. Anne Hathaway lived not in the spotlight of history, but in its margins, where most lives unfold. Her story is not one of dramatic gestures, but of persistence. She was a wife, a mother, and later a widow, navigating a world that offered her little recognition, yet demanded everything. To understand Shakespeare's family is to understand Anne not as a footnote, but as a central figure in a life shaped by absence, endurance, and quiet strength. And at the heart of that life stood her children, Susanna, Judith, and Hamnet, whose brief and fragile existences would leave marks far deeper than their sparse records suggest. The children grew beneath Anne Hathaway's steady watch, their lives unfolding within the narrow streets and timbered houses of Stratford-upon-Avon. Susanna, the eldest, was a quiet child by most accounts, raised with care and attention. As the firstborn, she bore the expectations of maturity early. Anne would have guided her through the skills expected of a young girl household: discipline, modesty, obedience, and practical competence. Judith and Hamnet, born together yet destined for very different paths, brought both companionship and complication. Twins were viewed with a mix of wonder and anxiety in the 16th century, symbols of both blessing and unpredictability. Hamnet, the only son, occupied a unique place in the household. In an era governed by inheritance laws favoring males, his life carried particular weight. Anne's hopes for the future were bound to his survival. From infancy, she would have guarded him closely, aware of how easily illness could steal a child away. Stratford, like all English towns of the period, was vulnerable to outbreaks of plague, fever, and dysentery. Medical care was limited to herbal remedies, prayers, and folk wisdom passed down through generations of women. William Shakespeare's visits home during these years were likely intermittent. When he returned, he brought stories of London, of playhouses, patrons, and crowded streets. For the children, he may have seemed both familiar and distant, a figure who arrived and departed with unsettling regularity. Anne bore the task of preserving his presence in their lives, speaking his name, reminding them of his role, and maintaining the household as a shared space despite his absence. By the early 1590s, Stratford experienced renewed outbreaks of disease. The plague did not discriminate, and children were especially vulnerable. In August 1596, tragedy struck the Shakespeare household. Hamnet, only 11 years old, died. The parish register records his burial on August 11, 1596. It offers no cause of death. No description of grief, only the fact of loss. For Anne Hathaway, the death of her son would have been devastating. The loss of a child was not uncommon, but familiarity did not lessen pain. Hamnet was not only her child but the carrier of the family's future. His death marked an emotional rupture that reshaped the household. Judith survived her twin by many decades, but the bond between them was broken in a way words could not repair. William Shakespeare was in London when Hamnet died. Whether he was present at the time of illness or arrived after the burial is unknown. The physical distance between father and son at the moment of death has long been a source of speculation. What can be said with certainty is that grief crossed that distance. The loss would have reached him through letters or messengers, transforming his success in London into something hollow and fragile. Anne endured the immediate aftermath alone. She oversaw burial arrangements, comforted Judith, survived her twin by many decades, but the bond between them was broken in a way words could not repair. William Shakespeare was in London when Hamnet died. Whether he was present at the time of illness or arrived after the burial is unknown. The physical distance between father and son at the moment of death has long been a source of speculation. What can be said with certainty is that grief crossed that distance. The loss would have reached him through letters or messengers, transforming his success in London into something hollow and fragile. Anne endured the immediate aftermath alone. She oversaw burial arrangements, comforted Judith, and maintained composure for Susanna. Her grief had no public outlet beyond prescribed mourning rituals. Widows and mothers were expected to grieve quietly without spectacle. Life had to continue. Meals still needed cooking. Clothes needed mending. Prayers needed saying. In the years following Hamnet's death, William Shakespeare's work took on a darker, more introspective tone. While no single play can be directly linked to personal tragedy, themes of loss, fathers and sons, memory, and mourning became increasingly prominent. For Anne, however, grief did not take artistic form. It lived in absence, in an empty space at the table, in Judith's solitary presence, in the unfulfilled future she had once imagined. As William's financial success grew, he invested in property in Stratford. In 1597, he purchased New Place, one of the town's largest houses. This acquisition marked a turning point. It provided Anne with material security and elevated the family's social standing. Though William continued to work primarily in London, New Place became the family's anchor, a visible symbol of success rooted in the town. Anne had never left. Anne moved into New Place with her daughters, overseeing a household larger and more complex than any she had managed before. Servants, gardens, storage rooms, and guest spaces all fell under her authority. Her role expanded from survival to stewardship. She was now the mistress of a prominent home, responsible for maintaining its reputation and order. Susanna grew into adulthood during this period. In 1607, she married John Hall, a physician of respectable standing. The marriage was advantageous, providing stability and continuity. Anne would later live with Susanna and her family, forming a close bond that endured into old age. Judith, by contrast, faced a more troubled path. Her later marriage to Thomas Quiney would bring scandal and disappointment, reflecting the uneven fortunes of the Shakespeare children. By 1613, William Shakespeare had largely withdrawn from London theatre life and returned to Stratford. His final years were spent closer to Anne than at any point since their early marriage. The nature of their reunion remains undocumented. There are no surviving personal reflections to reveal tenderness or distance, reconciliation or resignation. What remains is the evidence of shared space, shared property, and shared responsibility. In 1616, William Shakespeare fell ill and died at the age of 52. His will, drafted shortly before his death, left Anne the now famous second-best bed. The meaning of this bequest has been endlessly debated. In context, it likely reflected domestic reality rather than insult. The second-best bed was often the marital bed, rich with personal significance. Anne also retained the right to live in New Place for the remainder of her life, a protection that ensured her security. Anne Hathaway outlived her husband by 7 years. She died in 1623, at the age of 67, and was buried beside him in Holy Trinity Church. Her epitaph speaks not of scandal or subservience, but of dignity and virtue. She rests not as an appendage to Shakespeare's fame, but as a presence woven inseparably into his life. Her story, like those of countless women of her time, survives in fragments, legal records, parish registers, property deeds. Yet within those fragments lies a life defined by resilience. She married young, raised children largely alone, endured the loss of a son, and managed a household that bridged obscurity and fame. Hamnet's life was brief, but his absence echoed across generations. Anne carried that loss until her death, while William transformed it into language that continues to resonate. Together, though separated by distance and silence, they shaped a legacy born not only of genius, but of family grief and endurance. This is the story behind the name, a family bound by circumstance, sustained by labor, and remembered through what remains unsaid as much as what survives. Hamnet. Life, illness, and death. Hamnet. Shakespeare lived in a world where childhood was fragile and time uncertain. Born in early 1585 alongside his twin sister Judith, he entered a household already shaped by responsibility and restraint. Anne Hathaway was nearly 30 at the time, experienced in domestic labor and keenly aware of the dangers that accompanied infancy. From the moment Hamnet drew breath, his survival became a quiet vigil. Stratford-upon-Avon was not a safe place for children by modern standards. Disease moved invisibly through streets and homes. Wells could be contaminated, food spoiled easily, and medical understanding was limited to humoral theory and herbal practice. Anne would have relied on remedies passed down through generations, infusions of plants, poultices, careful observation of fever and breath. Prayer was as essential as medicine. Hamnet grew through early childhood under his mother's constant supervision. He learned to walk on uneven floors, to speak amid the noise of daily labor, to recognize church bells as markers of time. His father was largely absent, a figure spoken of rather than seen. Anne filled that absence with routine and discipline, ensuring that Hamnet understood his place within family and faith. As the only son, Hamnet represented continuity. His presence secured the family name and inheritance. Anne's hopes were shaped around him in ways they were not for her daughters. She would have imagined his apprenticeship, his future household, his role in carrying forward what had been built. These expectations were not sentimental fantasies, but practical necessities. In a society governed by lineage, the illness that took Hamnet came swiftly, as many did. There is no record of symptoms, no account of suffering. It may have been plague, fever, or another common childhood disease. Anne would have watched his condition worsen, measuring breath, temperature, responsiveness, helpless against forces she could neither name nor stop. When Hamnet died in August 1596, Anne lost not only a child but a future she had guarded for 11 years. The burial was conducted according to church custom, brief and solemn. There was no marker of his grave, no stone bearing his name. Children were buried simply, their lives acknowledged but not monumentalized. Anne returned home after the burial to a house altered beyond repair. Judith's grief would have been confused and profound, the loss of a twin severing a bond formed before memory. Susanna, older and more aware, would have absorbed the emotional weight of the household. Anne bore the responsibility of holding them together while carrying grief that had no language. Hamnet's death marked a permanent division in the Shakespeare family story before and after. Nothing that followed could restore what was lost. The household continued, but it did so with a silence that settled into daily life, shaping it subtly and irrevocably. Absence, grief, and Shakespeare's work. William Shakespeare's response to his son's death is undocumented, but absence itself became a defining feature of that loss. Physical distance prevented him from witnessing Hamnet's illness, from standing at his grave, from sharing immediate grief with Anne. That distance did not erase pain. It transformed it. Following 1596, Shakespeare's plays increasingly explored themes of loss, memory, mistaken identity, and the fragility of human bonds. Sons are lost and recovered, daughters mourned, families fractured and reunited. These patterns do not serve as direct autobiography, but they reflect a mind steeped in grief. For Anne, grief had no stage. It manifested in routine, setting places at table, maintaining order, ensuring survival. Her mourning was not preserved in language but in endurance. The rhythms of domestic life absorbed sorrow and redistributed it quietly across years. The separation between husband and wife during this period was not emotional abandonment but structural reality. London demanded Shakespeare's presence. Stratford demanded Anne's. Their lives unfolded in parallel, connected by obligation rather than proximity. When Shakespeare returned home periodically, the absence of Hamnet would have been unavoidable. A missing voice, a smaller household, an altered dynamic. No words survive to describe these reunions, but the impact of loss would have shaped them nonetheless. Grief did not weaken the family's resolve. Instead, it sharpened their focus on stability. Property investments, careful marriages, and financial planning became means of protecting what remained. Loss taught caution. Anne Hathaway in later life. As Anne aged, her role shifted from mother of young children to matriarch. Susanna's marriage to John Hall brought companionship and continuity. Anne lived with them in later years, forming a household centered on mutual dependence rather than authority. Judith's life unfolded with more difficulty. Her marriage in 1616 to Thomas Quiney was marked by scandal, legal trouble, and instability. Anne witnessed this with the perspective of experience, understanding how easily security could be compromised. When William Shakespeare died in 1616, Anne became a widow in a society that understood widowhood as both vulnerability and autonomy. She retained residence rights, legal protection, and familial support. Her survival was not precarious, but it was solitary. Anne's final years were quiet. She did not remarry. She lived among family, memory, and routine. The world had changed dramatically since her youth, religiously, politically, culturally, but her life remained grounded in familiar spaces. She died in 1623 and was buried beside William. Her epitaph honors her character rather than her relationship to him. She is remembered as a woman of virtue, not merely a playwright's wife. Legacy and historical silence. Anne Hathaway's life survives largely through absence. She left no letters, no recorded thoughts, no personal testimony. Yet her influence is undeniable. She shaped the conditions under which Shakespeare lived, worked, and returned. Hamnet's brief life altered the emotional landscape of one of history's most enduring bodies of work. His absence echoes through language, character, and theme. Anne carried that loss without voice, without audience. Their family story is not one of romance or myth, but of endurance. It reflects the lives of countless early modern families, defined by labor, shaped by loss, sustained by resilience. History remembers Shakespeare's words. It forgets the quiet strength that made those words possible. Anne Hathaway lived that strength, bore its cost, and passed from the world without recognition equal to her role. This is not a story of genius alone, but a family, of a woman who endured, a child who was lost, and a household that survived long enough to leave its mark on history.